Today is Thursday, May 5th, 2022, day 3 of our oral history interview with Bobby Smyth, my dad, and Coming to America. Here we go.
Okay, well, the last job I had while living in Edinburgh was a very interesting one. It was one for a company that built industrial bottle washers. Because remember all the time when the milkman used to come to the houses and deliver the big pints and quart bottles right to your door. And so all those things were all recycled back then. They picked them up and then they took them to the place where they put the milk in there, but they had a machine that washed all those big bottles. Now, that was all part of my job, but they found out that I wasn't claustrophobia like a lot of the guys were, because I had to go through that big bottle washing machine that held probably 30-odd bottles in little containers. And they had to have a belt going all the way through that machine with all those bottles and all the different cycles they used during the washing system of all those bottles. And I was the only guy that could get the beginning of that belt when it was all ready and they'd stretch it all out across the work, and all the belt had to go into that machine. But you couldn't push it very well, as you can imagine, so somebody had to drag it. So they put a little harness on me, and I would lie on my back and put just a pair of slippers on and crawl all the way through that machine, through all the rinsing and the washing. Of course, they weren't running much, but dry. I had to pull that whole belt. They were taking the weight up. 2 or 3 guys were helping to move the whole belt, of course, but I took up the slack all through that whole machine. And after a while, it got to be a little bit of a drag, always calling me to do that, because nobody else would do it. And so it was kind of a key position, but I didn't care much for it. And I wasn't going anywhere, because like I told you earlier, I didn't have the education to get promoted to any executive position. And so I figured life had pretty well stopped as far as advancing was concerned. And I was more adventurous for the future, but I wanted to get a better job. So anyway, I read in the newspaper that the government was coming out with a whole new system. The war had ended, and it was called the Empire Resettlement Scheme, because we had soldiers from Australia and India and Canada and all over the world, but the main two were Canada and Australians. They had pretty big contributions of soldiers then. And so these guys all stripped the industry pretty well of these guys going into the military. So now this was the British government's way of saying thanks, and it named it the resettlement scheme for the whole of the empire was available. And you could go to Australia, and that was £10, and Canada was £5. And so
You keep going. Oh, yeah, you keep going. You keep going, Dad.
So there was 2 opportunities for anybody that had been in the service. And so I got to thinking, my goodness, that would be great because I was looking for an opportunity to move on. And so I had the offer. I made my application, and they said that they will give you a guaranteed job, but you had to sign up for 2 years. And they would provide all of the bedding and the food. You were responsible for yourself, but all the lodging and security. For 2 years you had to sign up, otherwise you'd have to pay them back all the money. And so I thought, which one am I going to go? I love the Canadians and I love Canada, and I'd never been to Australia. And so here I sat, just sitting with the visitors, Canada or Australia, and they got it down to that. And so one time we were just, I had a friend that we used to do a little bit of darts and that in the tavern. I knew his folks were going away, but I didn't know where. So I got to talking to him, and he said, my folks are going to America. And I said, oh my God. I said, are they? Yeah. He said, they're going to have a going away party. Do you want me to invite you? And I said, yeah, you bet. And I've never met his father or his mother, and we lived in one of those big tenement areas where there were probably 4 stories of things that were run by the local government. And it had quite low, contributions to get into those low payment buildings. And anyway, I showed up, and during having a few quick ones with them, and when I went over to Benny Phelps was his name, and he was a compositor with one of the newspapers. And if you ever think of what a compositor is, he's a guy that takes all of the reading that goes backwards when they put it into the printing press. And so he has to kind of read things backwards as a compositor because nothing is being done there. And so he had a good job, but he was going to go out and go further too, look for a better job. And so I said to him, you're going to America? And he says, yeah. We're going to a place over on they call it, I'm trying to think, they had a name for Seattle, but anyway, they said we're going there. And I said, well, if you find anything that would be the kind of work that I could do, would you let me know what the opportunity's like, and then I could decide to see if I could maybe immigrate behind you once you get there. And that way I wouldn't be going to Australia or Canada, going to the US of A, which was everybody's dream. And so time went past, weeks went past, never heard a word. And one day I got this nice envelope from Mr. Phelps. And in those days, getting into the US wasn't just like sneaking across the border, believe it or not. You had to have a sponsor. And the sponsor, this gentleman, decided he was going to be my sponsor. And I never knew him other than his son. We were good friends. But anyway, in this envelope came a bank statement that he had enough funds in there to support his affirmation that he's my sponsor. And he had done all of that. And all I had to do was apply to come here, and got my application set up. I went for it, and the day came that when I headed to America, and there was aboard the Queen Elizabeth, nice old ship, and so I couldn't afford to have my own cabin, so I had a cabin, and it was split by a Jewish rabbi.
Oh my.
He slept in the top bunk, and I slept in the bottom. And the guy happened to have an ulcer. So he was waking up in the middle of the night, and the ulcer was bothering him, and then he would get a little verbal. You could hear him slapping his stomach and say, "Go away, go away." And I said, "You calling me?" "No, he's talking to his ulcer." But anyway, so there we were on the Queen Elizabeth, and I got a lot of little games and stuff that I brought home as souvenirs that you could play all together in the painting room where they had. And then came our time for the first bath. So it was a community bath, of course, for the low end of, they called it, I'm trying to think of the name of it, but it was like the low end of the passenger list. People were all having cabins and things like that, and this way you had to just share this one with a rabbi. So anyway, I got my nice quality smelling soap and got down into the shower and turned it on, and after the water got nice and warm, I started trying to soap myself, and there was no foam or no suds. And I thought, what's happening to this soap that I have? So anyway, I couldn't get myself all soaped up. And so I just finally got out of there and dried my hands and stopped the first guy that was waiting in line to get into the shower. And I said, "There's something funny about that shower." I said, "I can't soap myself." He said, "Oh," he said, "you don't think you're getting fresh water to have a bath, do you? That's all salt water. It's a tourist part of the ship." And I said, "Oh, not but a wonder."
Oh my.
So anyway, it was always soak yourself up standing outside the shower and wash and then jump into the cold salt water shower. Anyway, when we got to New York, I didn't have an awful lot of cash with me. And when we got through all of the immigration and got that all sorted, as soon as I went to look for a cab, as soon as the door opened, there was about 3 guys there all waiting to carry my case. And I says, "I don't have a lot of money." He says, "We know you're good for it." Tips that we're looking for. Mm-hmm. And they carried it from here probably 20 feet to where the cab was. And then their hands came up. And I gave them a 2-shilling piece, which was probably about 50 cents here. And they looked at it and they said, 2 shillings in an English money? He said, "We take this and we throw it away." I said, "Well, fine, thank you very much, I'll keep it." And I put it in my pocket and I climbed into that cab, and boy, were they ever verbal about getting away without giving them the money, because it was in English money I had. Anyway, I told the cabbie, I said, "Now, remember, I don't have a lot of money. I've probably got maximum a couple of pounds with me, and that's all the cash I could scrounge up." And they said, "Well, we'll take you to the best place they can." And so they took me to this cheap hotel. Same thing, as soon as the cab door opened, there was a guy there with his nice uniform on, went to grab my suitcase. And I said, "I don't have much money." He said, "Well, we're doing the service." That was fine until they took me to the door of the Century Hotel, was the name of it. And it was the best thing or the worst thing that happened in the Century, because they were terrible too, everybody looking for a tip. They held their hand out again. They didn't even go into the hotel. They took it from the car to the hotel door and left it. Then a door opened and another guy with his uniform on and his World War I medals that looked really important. And he grabbed it again. And from there to the desk. they put that thing down where I had to check in, and they were holding their hands out. So by the time I got all through, I didn't have very much coins left by the time I got there. And so it took me over to the elevator. I got in the elevator, and of course the guys then was all manual operated. There wasn't no automatic elevators back then. And so I got another ride to the floor, and the guy was waiting on that. Every step you took, they held their hand out. And so they opened the door, and the guy says, I'm taking you to your room. And I said, but you're not taking my luggage. I'm carrying my luggage. I can't afford it. And so he says, as you want. So I finally got a room there in that hotel, Century Hotel. So the next morning, I had to check in. So I was asked a guy, I said, do you have a bus or something that goes from here to the airport where you can check in for the flight the next day? And he said, yeah, we'll take you there. And in those days, they had old propeller airplanes. And they were gas airplanes, and they didn't have a lot to lift. So there was none of this business of carrying a nice box with a bunch of stuff in there. And I had 6 bottles of beer from Edinburgh to take to the Scotsman. 6 bottles. In my overcoat, I had 3 bottles in each pocket. And in those days, they made you get on a scale. They weighed you. Yeah, as well as your luggage, they weighed you because they only had a certain weight, pardon me, that those airplanes could carry. And I got on, and the gal looked at me and she said, you look pretty slim. How come you weigh so much? And I said, well, I got a little extra stuff in my pocket. And she said, well, how much have you got? And I got 6 bottles of beer. And she said, can you pay for that? And I said, no. And she says, and what's that old metal box? I said, that's my mechanic's tools that are in those. She says, well, why don't we just take those off of you and we'll send them via the train. And you wait about a week and a half before your 3 bottles of beer and your tools arrive. And I said, well, what else? And she says, what are you going to do with the rest? I said, I'm going to drink it. So anyway, she let me leave there, and I had my book with the idea that when I went back there was going to be a little wait, but wasn't going to be showing. Anyway, I went into the Grand Central Station there. No breakfast yet, and I didn't have any money to buy one anyway.
Oh no.
So I went in there, and I knew I had about 45 minutes to kill. And I thought, well, I'm going to take a little pee here. Went over, and the door was locked. And they had a little place there for 25 cents. And no shoot, here I am again. Every time I wanted anything, I had to put my hand in my pocket. So I paid the money, and I went into that toilet, and I drank 1.5 screw tops of beer. And I had 1.5 left for the gift of my friend when I got here. And so anyway, it was nothing like the six bottles that I had, but I told them there was 3 coming in the mail, which wasn't the same, you know.
Right.
Well, anyway, that was the answer to that, and so there wasn't any pain felt, but I still hadn't had anything to eat yet. So I'm just wandering around there, looking around to see if there was anything free. Not very much. But anyway, I spotted this one guy was sitting outside the toilet, and he had this big apple. and he's just munching on that apple and chewing and chewing and chewing. And so I figured, I'm going to watch that guy. And finally he got about halfway through there, and I said, don't throw it in the garbage. He set it on the seat beside him and walked away he had to get a train or something or whatever he had to do, and he left that sitting there. And boy, I was on top of that big apple. And the days of terrible infections coming from other people, that wasn't even thought of way back then. There's no such a thing as that stuff, AIDS and all of that. So I grabbed that big apple, and that was my breakfast, was eating a half-eaten apple. And I didn't arrive as a fat Englishman or Irishman or had a lot of anything. I was pretty poor when I got there. And of course it wasn't like today where you could fill in New York and come to Seattle. I had to take the milk train they called it. It stopped at every little community all the way between New York and Seattle. It was one of those things, up, down, up, down. But in most of those places I managed to get free coffee. So I was doing pretty good. Then when we finally got to Seattle after about 9 hours in the plane of shifting and changing planes, because like I say, they only had limited seating, limited weight, they weighed you, and so they had to go through. This was what that's your normal travel. Mm-hmm. So there was no griping or anything. You just took what they gave you available. So now I'm in Seattle, and we're coming down the ramp, and I thought, oh my God, I haven't seen those guys from the last time we were in their house drinking beer and having a good time. I said, oh my God, I know it's a man and a woman, and his name is Benny, but what else? I didn't know his wife's name. So here's all these people coming down the gangplank and milling and hugging each other. And this is SeaTac now. No going in and going into the lounge and all of that stuff. That was the terminal. And so all of the meeting and the greeting was all done right at the end of the airplane when you come down the ramp. Then you had to walk in there and go through immigration. So here I am standing there at the bottom of the steps where all the people that were a big crowd and people were greeting each other. And finally they got down lower and lower and lower. And there was a man and a woman and me and myself. And so I finally edged my way over. I said, is your name Benny? It is. He says, you must be Bobby. And I said, that's me. We hugged each other. And here's two people I had only met once. And now they're my friends. Now they take me home and had a nice dinner waiting on me and everything. The only problem was they had a good-sized family living there. And so they had one teenage son that had a little tiny room. And she says, you're going to be sleeping with Tommy. He's still in school. And so a guy I'd never met, I'm sleeping with already. But I was happy. And like she says, you don't owe me anything. The food's free. What difference is it an extra spoonful of something in the pot? And she says, I don't want you looking for a job either for at least a couple of weeks. Just kind of feel your way around town and how to get from here to there and look up places that may want to hire you. And I said, well, that sounds okay. So she said, but don't be doing that for a while. Spend time looking around. And I said, that's just fine. So she had a job, and Benny had a job as a compositor with the newspaper. And now I'm all alone. And I thought, what am I sitting here for? So I went all through my pockets again, and I have enough to get on the bus to get downtown and enough to bring me back. And that's what I'm going to do. And I went downtown, and the second day I had a job. Because all you have to do anywhere is go to the boss or whoever's in charge and say, I need money. I just got here, I'm from the other side of the world, I don't have any money. And can you give me money doing anything you want me to do? And he just looked out like he had been shot, because most people say, how much an hour am I going to get, and all of that stuff. I just said, I don't care what you've got. I need money. I need cash in my hand, no matter what it is. And he looked at me and he said, I've never been through anything like that. He said, what if I asked you to clean the toilet? I said, anything you want me to do, I'll do. He said, well, I can sure as hell find a job for you for a few days, cleaning the toilet and sweeping floors. Is that okay? I said anything. And so I got a job and I got some money at the end. He kept me 3 days. And I got 3 days money now. And so I could give Mrs. Phillips a little money. And she fought to take it, but she did in the end. And so that's how I got started. I mean, from ground zero, and you hear people saying, there's no work. I can't find a job. Like, heckin' you can't. Lower your standards until they start paying you money and you've got yourself a job. It all depends on how bad you need it. And I needed it bad. Yeah. And so that was my start to the US of A. And I loved every second of it. Yeah. And so from then on, I looked up different places because I was a machinist. And I got a couple of quick jobs and stuck with a few and just kept getting better and better. And I met another Scotsman who had a business there. And of course, talking the same brrr and understanding each other with their accents, we get along just fine. And I stayed here for about a year working for him.
What was that company?
This was in Spokane Street.
Okay.
And it was just before you go up the bridge. And unfortunately, a dog hired me. And there was a big old stray. And I used to park my car below the viaduct there in Spokane Street. And as soon as I opened the door to that dog wanted me real bad. He got in the car beyond me. As soon as the door cracked open, he was in there, big old sheepdog. And so now I had a dog. Still living with the Phillipses.
Oh.
And they were wonderful people. And then we decided, Donald, the guy who became my lifelong friend, the guy that taught me how to play the ukulele, he said, why don't we go up to one of the taverns? And in Seattle, you have to know Seattle. The end of the city was about a block and a half away from where we lived, and I'm still in town. And the house we lived in, it was built by, the labor guys when they were in there for the wood. And so they were the guys that built the houses. They weren't carpenters. And anyway, they didn't respect boundaries or anything. They just moved out there and they say where one was, where the boundary was, and they just built the house. So they built the top story and the bottom over the sidewalk, where the sidewalk was platted.
Yeah.
But see, nobody bothered way back then because it was a scarce city. You could build on a 25-foot lot, 25 feet. And nobody worried about the setbacks or anything like that. So before I got there, they were tightening things up because they were starting to bring the main street down alongside us. Where the house was one house in from the main street. And I looked, I said, where's the half of the house? So what they did, they cut the whole ground floor off this house and left the top floor because nobody walks that high in the air, and that was for the sidewalk to go through. So the sidewalk is going through half of their house, and that is still there to this day. There's a half a house sitting over this sidewalk. And back then it was wonderful. Ballard was the most wonderful on earth. A lot of Norwegians had all settled there. And it was a wonderful place to stay. And I went to the shipyard. I tried to get into the shipyard because that was where my main experience was, building around ships and engines and things like that. And so I got into the shipyard, and the guy said, "You're going to have to go," and I'd hired in there, and I wasn't working yet, but I'd hired in there. One of the workmen where I was going to be with in there, he said, "You know, you got to be a union person to work here." And I said, "Well, I'm a machinist union from Scotland, and I've got my book over there." He said, "This isn't Scotland anymore." He said, "You're going to have to go to the union." And I went to the union, and they said, "Do you have a job?" And I said, "Not yet, but I'm going to." He said, "You can't be hired in here as a union person unless you have a job." He said, "We don't hire unemployed people." Another roadblock. And I said, "Are you telling me that I've been promised a job when I'm a union man, and the union man tells me I can't be a union man until I'm employed?" Went around and around, and he said, "You can't join until you're hired." So back to Holland, back to the, not Holland, well, that's a long time ago, back to the shipyard again, and went to see the manager. And the manager says, "Well, tell me about where you worked." But I was gone from Holland and Roth then. And he says, "What have you done?" I said, "Well, I've been doing a lot of stuff." And he says, "Have you done anything with diesel electric?" And I said, "Oh, well, I haven't, but the new ferry system they brought in there, it's electric motor driven." And he said, "Were you actually involved in that?" I was. He says, "And we don't have anybody here with that kind of experience."
Was this at May and Smyth?
Pardon?
Was this at the company called May and Smyth?
No, that was the one that I went to and stayed for a year.
Oh, okay.
Afterwards.
Was that Fentron?
No,
No.
that's Man Smith.
May and Smith. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
See, I was with him for quite a while. He was a Scot. That's the Scotsman I
Oh, okay.
had.
Okay.
But anyway, so the guy says, "Well," he said, "I know it's in the contract that if I can't find anybody with a special talent, then I can hire outside the union." And so that's what he used to get me in there. So back up to the union again, and I said, "I've got a job." And he said, "Where?" And I said, "It's a shipyard." He says, "I damn well told you, you can't come in here until you have a job." I says, "I do. I'm hired by them because I have a talent that nobody in this group has, is with diesel electric." He says, "Oh," he says, "you SOB." He said, "You're just finding a way around all of our rules and regulations." And I said, "Well, sorry, that's the game we play." So they had to hire me and give me a union card. Now back to work again. Back to work. So now I'm working there for about maybe a month and a half. Got a nice little machinist job there. And so after a weekend, the second or third weekend had just passed by, that sometimes you work on weekends or overtime, and it's double time, so it makes a big difference. So anyway, I had a whole bunch of valves that they were going to make on a rush job at my machine when I left on a Saturday. And when I came in the next Monday, all of that work was gone. And so I went to the foreman. And I said, where's all the valves I'm supposed to be doing this week at double time? He says, you can't, we gave the job away. I said, you took the job that I had piled next to my machine and you gave it to another guy that works for you and me? He says, yeah, just chippery like. And I said, oh? Where in the union thing does it say that you can do this? He says, we have that prerogative. And I said, now that's interesting. Your prerogative, huh? And you decided to do me out of all that double time and give it to another guy, the machinist in the same shop. I said, that's not right. He says, it is certainly right, because that's the way it is. And I said, oh, really? He says, have you ever heard of the thing called seniority? And I said, what in the heaven's name are you talking about? We didn't have anything like that back home, nothing. And I said, seniority, how do you get that? He says, by working here a long time. You have seniority. And I said, you mean to tell me you're taking away my double time and giving it to another guy who's worked here longer than I have? And that's how you get to earn it? And I have no chance of ever reaching seniority around here. He says, well, that's the way it is. I said, okay. Went and packed up all my toolbox and just went into his office and said, adios. And away I went. And that's when I went to May and Smyth. I walked in there and here's this good Scottish roll, and I could put that on pretty well. And he says, I'll hire you. He says, and there's no seniority here. He says, we pay you for what you do. And I was hired by them for, God, almost 2 years. I worked there. And that was the funnest job I had. There was more shenanigans going on. And just, I'll tell you one outstanding thing that will probably make you smile a little bit. Some of the guys, they used to play things on each other and put boxes on top of the door and leave it ajar, and then call them when this bunch of empty boxes would fall down on their head. You know, just a jokester, simple, just little laughs once in a while. And anyway, so we were going out there, and this black guy, and he turned out to be another lifelong friend. And he came in there, and all these boxes hit him, and the boss was right behind him and saw all this shenanigans going on. And he said, I opened the damn door to my place, he says, and I see all my profits rolling down through the door out to the front. He said, all my profits, my time that I'm paying for you, all this bloody lecturing going on. And then he said, well, you ought to know better. He said, well, forget the whole thing, but knock off all the clowning. So the one funny thing that I have to tell you about, this Whittier was a great guy. But anyway, one time it was getting pretty rough, some of the games we were playing with each other. So we had to vacuum, because we generated a lot of carbon dust. And you had to have that vacuum going when you were cutting it because of a lot of dust. So anyway, Whittier had done something to me and I was going to get him back. And so I got the blower side of the vacuum hose and plugged it onto the blower end, and I took about 4 handfuls of that carbon dust and I slid it into the blower end and put it in the toilet. And who walked in there but my friend Whittier? And then when we wanted to start that thing, the door flew open and here's Whittier all covered in this black. He was black, but he was about 4 shades darker. He was going to kill me. And everybody just couldn't die. Here's a black guy, really black, and on a joker I had played. But they were very nice people. And anyway, that was another one of those things that I could have stayed forever with them. They were so nice. And I worked and they worked, but it was a very boring job. See, we made parts for the steam turbines, and so a ship would come in and they had their turbine was leaking. And so we had to build new seals out of this carbon and fit it in there so that it would keep the steam from leaking around the shaft that was going through there. And it was always rush, rush, rush. And I didn't mind, but that's what we did all of that time. And so one time I said, I think I'm getting a little tired here, because it was there at least a couple of years. I said, I'm getting a little tired and I want to look a little further. And he says, well, okay. He said, when you go to the union and ask them to give you some people, small companies that were looking for machine people. And so they gave me a whole list of maybe 8 or 9 companies that were looking for employees. And so I took off with this list and I thought, what the hell with that? I put it in my glove compartment with my old car. And I'm driving around and I hit the university district. I'm riding up and down thinking, God, I've never been over in this place. And on one side of the road I was going, there were all these big fancy buildings. And there's all those university old buildings, beautiful ceilings and big roofs. And so I thought, what is that? So there was an opening there. I drove through it, and one of the guards said, who are you looking for? I said, I'm looking for a job. He said, well, you've been the right gate, because just up here, he said, about half a block, is the employment office. And if you want to look for a job, that's a good place to look. So he says, you don't need a pass, just go in there and park. And I went in there, and the woman who was hiring this stuff said, you came just at the right time, because over in the medical instrument building, where they build new things for medical research and stuff, he said, they just had a guy retire from there. And they're looking for a medical instrument maker. Have you had any experience? I said, no, I don't have any experience in that. And it said, well, a lot of it will be working like a watchmaker's lathe, making little lathes this big and turning little accurate parts. I said, but that's the trade I'm in. When you're an instrument maker, you should be able to work any of those machines. He said, you sound so confident. He said, I'm just going to send you over there, and if they like you, they'll give you 30 days trial. I went over there and she says, we just left an empty space here and we've got a lot of work to do. We'll put you on trial, probation. And I walked in there and stayed there for 26 years.
Wow, Dad.
Yeah.
Wow.
That was the end of my working year.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
Yeah.
But you didn't quit working then. You did some other odd side jobs along the route, along the way.
Yeah.
There was something in our basement you would tool and make things.
And you see, I went from there to when the supervisor of the instrument shop left. He is retired. They came to me and they said, the main thing about you is you get along with everybody. That's more important to us. That the guy will keep peace and quiet here. We're a university group and we don't want no fights and job discrimination and all of that stuff. That's how I got it. And then they opened an electronics shop for getting into all of the electrical type of machines and building new stuff, new tools, new surgical tools. And then they put me in charge of that. So I had all the mechanical part and then all the advanced tools. I was put in charge of both of them.
And you challenged yourself, because I remember young in grade school that you would go weekly to the university for night school because they offered free college education
Exactly.
for classes, and you took them and
That's
just
right.
kept increasing and increasing your abilities. Wow.
And then if you didn't qualify for that, you could just take any class and go sit in there for no credit. But I could take any class that's offered and just go sit in there and watch what's going on and try to listen and gain something. But that was all open. A wonderful place to work.
Mm-hmm. A wonderful place to go to school, too.
Now, see, back to the place that I was in with this man Smyth, if I hadn't have showed that little bit of restlessness and to move on to something different, I'd still have been there at the bottom of the heap.
Yeah.
Because the son-in-law was the guy that was in charge of everything, and they were going to get rid of him. Yeah.
Wow.
And so that's my advice to young people who are afraid to move. There are times in your life where you just have to say, I can do better than this. And if your circumstances, permit you to do that, go do it. I would still be living in Ireland if I had done anything different. And that's the main thing.
Today we're going to stop here, and our next session tomorrow we'll do Love in America. Who did Dad fall in love with when he hit the States? Not alone the United States, but who were the wives and their in the stories and how he met them.
Amen.
Thanks, Dad.